when America finishes supplying the manpower and the military for standardization of the world into the one system, and they want a secular world society with a hint of greening and Gaia worship for sustainability reasons. America, as they're finishing off this agenda, they'll be pulling the rug from underneath Americans at home at the same time towards the latter stages. They're now pulling the rug away from under the feet of the people. They're becoming rapidly a non-manufacturing country. Any country that can't manufacture its own goods, even for self-defense, therefore is no longer sovereign, independent, and able to sustain itself, which tells you that this is all part of the plan.
It started with the very beginning, when you established that there was a Federal Reserve System given the power of the state to create money out of nothing, and to do so without any regard to the will of the people, without any regard to what's behind the money system. In other words, strictly political and economic motives for the bankers and the politicians. Once you granted that power to a group, the Federal Reserve System, the economic crisis was inevitable. This has happened before. Every time in history when the government was given the power, or a group of banks in conjunction with the government was given the power to expand the money supply at will, those economic systems always wound up in crisis and always collapsed. So there's no reason to believe that the United States was given some kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, an exemption from the processes of history. So the economic crisis began at the very beginning, and as a matter of fact, when the founders of the Federal Reserve System met on Jekyll Island back in 1910 and were drafting the Federal Reserve Act, one of the things they discussed was how to pass on the inevitable losses to the taxpayers. They knew that inevitably something like this would happen, and they knew that there had to be some way to get out of it without destroying the banks, of course, because they were the banks. And they said, aha, we'll go into partnership with the government, we'll take our cartel agreement and pass it into law, call it the Federal Reserve Act, and we'll make the taxpayer come online and be responsible to bail us out if and when the failure finally comes.
We're going into the greatest depression. There will be no job growth. Unemployment will continue to escalate. Along with it, so too will crime, poverty, kidnappings, boss snappings. And the more things spin out of control, the harder the hammer is going to come down by the federal government to keep everyone in control.
Power is much, much more important to them than money is. Money is only a way to the means. Power is the end result.
The elite's main goal is to destroy national sovereignty and individual independence. To consolidate their grip on power, the banksters create artificial debt bubbles that are mathematically impossible to pay back.
These are those sinister, toxic assets, the complex financial instruments that they talk about but never really name. They're paper based on paper. They're credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, structured investment vehicles, auction rate securities, and so on down the line. It's an immense mass of cancerous, fictitious, speculative paper, bloated in value, impossible to bail out. Triage the derivatives on their books. There's no way to bail out a $1.5 quadrillion black hole of derivatives, but nevertheless they tried.
The Wall Street cronies are crooks. If you leave the vault to the bank open, these people are going to help themselves. The job of the government is to make sure there's somebody there to make sure the vault is closed, and very few people have the combination.
I'm William K. Black, Associate Professor of Economics and Law at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. I was a senior regulator in a number of different positions during the heart of the savings and loan crisis. On a staff level, I led the re-regulation of the savings and loan industry. The purpose of regulation and effective criminal prosecution is to make sure that cheaters don't prosper, that honest manufacturers win in competition. The primary driver of the current crisis is accounting control fraud. These are frauds led by the CEOs of the major lending institutions and major banks and institutional buyers of toxic waste product. How did it start? It started with mortgages, particularly non-prime mortgages. In September of 2004, the FBI warned that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud, their words, and that this epidemic of mortgage fraud would cause an economic crisis at least as large as the savings and loan debacle if it wasn't stopped. The FBI found that 80% of the mortgage fraud was being induced by the lenders, not by the borrowers. You know, much of the rage has been against the borrowers, but if you want rage, it should be at the CEOs who became fabulously wealthy by following a strategy based on fraud.
The Wall Street people and their friends here at the Federal Reserve and at the U.S. Treasury and down the Washington Mall here at the U.S. Capitol. That's where the damage was done, and if people want to vent their anger, they need to vent it against these people.
Presumably what most politicians want to come in is say, hey, the problems of the past, they're due to the old guy, and I'm cleaning house, and I'm going to bring in a new team, and don't blame us for the things we've inherited. Can't say, you know, those policies of the past that came before were insane because you got the guy that was one of the key architects of those policies.
People need to stop having allegiance to their political party. They need to have allegiance to the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and what has made our republic so special. The basic human rights and dignity that every citizen of this country inherently has. It's an endless, staged, gladiatorial event, special interest own both parties, and they project this false left-right paradigm up as like a movie screen. And behind that, behind the throne, the establishment is able to control our society and engineer it into this high-tech police state.
If you try to let the finance oligarchs who created the crisis turn around and say they're the doctors who are going to get you out of the crisis, they will dig you deeper and deeper into the bottomless abyss of world economic depression, financial collapse, and disintegration.
Glass-Steagall said there's an inherent conflict of interest between the commercial banking side, which is the lending side, and the investment banking side, which is taking an ownership position. And we have to end this conflict of interest by separating these two entities. You can have investment banks and you can have commercial banks, but they have to be separate.
You could be a commercial bank like Chase Manhattan, or you could be an investment house like J.P. Morgan, or a bank like Bank of America, or an investment house like Merrill Lynch. But you couldn't be both. And as the 90s went on, the screaming hyenas of Wall Street were demanding that this prohibition, this regulation, be abolished.
This was an illegal and inappropriate form of casino. The derivatives were being used and they were being unregulated, and people were getting 30 to 1, 40 to 1, 50 to 1, and sometimes 100 to 1 profits on the way up. And remember, derivatives are a zero-sum game. So there's nothing there. It's not like a piece of stock in General Electric or Ford or something like that where there's supposed to be some value. Derivatives have no value. But the very people, Summers and Gettner and all the people at Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan who created these things made not millions or billions but trillions on the way up. And now that these things are crashing, the very same folks are now put in charge of regulating these things and in charge of the bailout, and they are giving money to the very rascals that created this problem, took the profits. The problem cannot be fixed. And this is on Obama's watch right now.
You have so many different schemes and mechanisms at play. It's sort of like after there's a blackout, people in some parts of the country have been known to loot the local stores. They go in, they grab the televisions, and they grab the stereos. And basically that's what the Wall Street gang has done. They've just engaged in this massive looting of money from their own companies and now from the U.S. Treasury.
This was a pre-registered, pre-organized, predetermined event. Anybody who knows that if you allow the banks to become unregulated financial institutes with tsunami-like weapons of mass destruction like financial instruments like derivatives, to allow that to run up to levels that are 50, 100, 200 times the gross domestic product with no value. They know that they are taking the profits on going up, but they also know that the end result is the destruction and gutting of this economy.
The scam is simple. The insiders buy hard assets and political influence as the fiat bubbles expand. And then, at a time of their choosing, they purposefully implode the bubble.
You've got a very small group of people, and the Federal Reserve and the global central banking system and the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, who are purposefully managing the boom and bust, credit supply, credit contraction, money supply growth, money supply contraction, to create artificial roller coasters and artificial volatility that they can trade around without taking any risk. It doesn't cost them any money. And if they do make a mistake because they're, as George Bush said, the bankers on Wall Street are drunk.
It is uncertain. There's no question about it. Wall Street got drunk. That's one of the reasons I should turn on the TV cameras.
Let's say they walk in one day, they push the wrong button, and they lose the bank $1 billion or $5 billion or $100 billion. They can appeal to the government to bail them out. It's a totally asymmetric relationship between bankers and the rest of the economy. If they make a mistake, they get bailed out. If everyone else makes a mistake, they get put in jail, called a terrorist, and we never hear from them again.
But it's a more sophisticated form of slavery, and we're going through it today. We see the taxation is going up all the time with the supposed crash of the banks that was not a happening out of the blue. It was set up for this time. They could have kept it going for another few years if it suited them, and then crashed all the bubbles. But now is the time. As they say in their own writings, now is the time.
One of the great benefits of an economic model from an economist standpoint is you can basically get whatever results you want. You can manipulate the inputs to make that happen. And that makes it a very easy tool to use to hoodwink other people.
These manufactured, these engineered financial catastrophes are the result of a central banking system that has the ability to add and subtract credit, add and subtract dollars and money at will to create this roller coaster effect. Because unlike most people, the banks are able to make profits as easily on the way down as they can on the way up in any given situation. Volatility is great for banks and professionals. Volatility is not great for the most average people.
Their operatives in government and media then hold the economy hostage by issuing the ultimatum: give us unlimited bailout money or the economy dies.
What's being used is what I call, to try to get the money, is what I call the suicide threat, where, if anybody has ever seen the movie Blazing Saddle, the sheriff is surrounded by hostile town folks. He takes out his gun, points it at his head and says, don't move or I'll shoot. Well, that's what the big banks are saying. Give us unlimited cash or we'll die. And if we die, you'll die because we're too big to fail.
We have, people in the government threatening martial law or things to get their way in the executive branch against Congress. If you put all these signs together, it doesn't look good at all. That, to the extent we are a democracy, we're sort of a hairbreadth away from a police state.
Congress aided the bankers in carrying out the biggest heist in history with the so-called banker bailout of 2008.
The bailout money, the $13 trillion or so dollars that have been given to the banks, is sitting on the balance sheet of the banks, and that is incurring interest costs. And that's going to precipitate the need to flush the system with more cash. And at some point, the dam will break, and you're going to have very high inflation. Some predict hyperinflation.
You cannot print phantom money out of thin air, backed by nothing and producing practically nothing without destroying the world economy.